Okay, we are back. Judith has come to visit. Hi, Judy. Okay, you ready for your story? All right, so here are our questions for chapter 15 and 16. And it says, what did the old woman decide to do with Edward? Then the crows were insistent. They flew around Edward / Clyde and picked his clothes. He even compared one crow to, oh, Pellegrina, she's coming back. And why do you think at this point he was done with caring? Describe the conversation that Edward had with the stars. Don't forget your strategy focuses when you want to extend the text focus. You do not have to write anything down. All you have to do is think about it and be ready to make a connection. Okay, so if you had a conversation with the stars, what would it be about? And what caused Edward to have feelings of joy? And then making connections, because we're always making connections. This is going to be your writing activity. Good readers make connections to what they're reading to their own lives. When Edward is hanging like a scarecrow and watching the crows fly around him, he wishes he could fly. He thinks if he could fly, he wouldn't have fallen in the ocean. Explain in 1 or 2 sentences how your life would change if you had wings and you could fly. That sounds like a pretty cool prompt. Okay, so chapter 15, here we go. All right, so in the morning, the sun rose and the crickets' song gave way to a bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road. This is gonna be strange. I'm sorry, guys. I gotta get organized here. This is my first try, but I can't see the words through my phone, so okay. Here we go. In the morning, the sun rose and the cricket song gave way to a bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. Huh, she said, and she pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. Looks like a rabbit, she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. Only he ain't real. She stood back up. Huh, she said again. She rubbed her back. What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say. Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away, and he had been replaced with a different feeling, one of hollowness and despair. Pick me up or don't pick me up, the rabbit thought. It makes no difference to me. The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish. Then she kept walking, swinging the basket and singing, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." Edward, in spite of himself, listened. I've seen troubles too, he thought. You bet I have, and apparently they aren't over yet. Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his ears to a wooden pole and spread his arms out as if they were flying and attached to his paws in the pole by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, oh dear, pie tins hung from the pole. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. Ain't a doubt in my mind that you could scare them off. You could scare them off, the old woman said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. Go on, Clyde, said the woman. She clapped her hands. You gotta act ferocious. Clyde, Edward thought. He felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sigh out loud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. Get to work. Clyde, she said, scare them birds off. And then she walked away from him, out of the garden, and toward her small house. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads of his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear, caw, 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 without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. Go ahead, he thought. Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I am done with caring. Caw, caw, said the Pellegrina crow. Finally, the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars. But for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. You are down there alone, the stars seemed to say to him. And we are up here in our constellations together. I have been loved, Edward told the stars. So, said the stars, what difference does that make when you are all alone now? Edward could think of no answer to that question. Eventually, the sky lighted and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with him. Ooh, chapter 16, and there's our boy. All right, so for right now, these are your questions. What did the old woman decide to do with Edward? The crows were insistent. They flew around Edward/Clyde and picked at his clothes. He even compared one crow to Pellegrina. Why do you think at this point he was done with caring? Now, make sure you're making connections to all of the things that Edward has gone through from the beginning of the story, Abilene, Nellie and Lawrence, and then Bull and Lucy. And then try to think to yourself, why do you think at this point he's done with caring? Describe the conversation that Edward had with the stars. Okay? And the next questions are for chapter 16. So make sure you're journaling, and I would love if you take a picture of your train and your adventures and the answers to these questions and send them to Remind so I can look at how you guys are feeling about what's happening to Edward and all of his grand adventures. Take care, and I will read chapter 16 tomorrow. Period.